The moment I signed the closing papers on my property in Ridgemont Springs, Colorado, I knew exactly why the previous owner had priced it $30,000 below market value. It came with a functioning natural spring and an HOA that loved to meddle in everything. My name is Frederick Quentin, and I had spent 15 years working as a hydrologist for the Colorado Department of Natural Resources before deciding to retire early at 45. The irony of what would happen next still makes me shake my head. When I found the property listing for 3 acres on the outskirts of Ridgemont Springs, complete with a century-old stone springhouse and year-round water flow, I thought I had hit the jackpot. The house itself was modest, a renovated 1920s farmhouse with original hardwood floors and enough character to make up for its small square footage. But that spring, that beautiful, crystal-clear spring bubbling up from the limestone aquifer beneath my property, that was the real treasure. I moved in during March, when the snow was still melting and the spring was running at full capacity. The water collected in a small natural pool before flowing down through a series of stone channels the original homeowners had built decades ago. The overflow eventually made its way into a creek that ran along the southern boundary of the HOA community. I spent my first few weeks just enjoying the peace, listening to the gentle sound of running water and marveling at how cold and pure it tasted. I had the water tested at a private lab, and it came back cleaner than most bottled water on the market. The HOA did not contact me until mid-April. I was out by the spring, clearing some winter debris from the channels, when I heard a car pull up my long gravel driveway. A woman emerged from a white Mercedes SUV, her blonde hair cut in that specific style that seemed to be required for women of a certain age and tax bracket. She wore pressed khaki pants and a pastel pink sweater despite the warm spring afternoon. "Hello there," she called out, waving as she approached. "You must be Frederick. I am Sharon Whitmore, president of the Ridgemont Springs HOA." I stood up, wiping my muddy hands on my jeans. "Nice to meet you. Just cleaning up around the spring." Sharon's smile remained fixed, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at the water feature. "Yes, about that. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood and also discuss some community standards we maintain here in Ridgemont Springs." "I appreciate the welcome," I said, already sensing where this might be heading. Though technically my property predates the HOA by about 80 years, the previous owner had it grandfathered in according to my title search. "Yes, well," Sharon said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "While that may be technically true, we all live in this community together and we have certain aesthetic standards. That spring of yours with all this moss and the old stonework, it is quite rustic. Some might even say unsightly." I stared at her for a long moment. "Unsightly." "It is a natural spring. It has been here since before either of us was born." "I understand your attachment to it," Sharon continued, pulling out a folder from her designer handbag, "but several community members have expressed concerns. The way the water flows down toward the creek, all those stones and the wet areas, it attracts insects and wildlife. Just last week, Margaret Hollings saw a deer on her property, and we are quite certain it came from this direction." "A deer," I repeated slowly. "In Colorado." "A wild deer," Sharon corrected, as if that made a significant difference. "We have invested a great deal in maintaining the cultivated appearance of Ridgemont Springs. Many of our residents chose this community specifically because of its manicured landscapes and controlled environment." I crossed my arms. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" Sharon brightened, apparently taking my question as an invitation. "We would like you to cap the spring. You could still have access to the water, of course. We are not unreasonable." You could install a proper well system with a pump, keep it all underground and neat. Then you could landscape the area properly, perhaps with some attractive river rock and drought-resistant plants. I have a wonderful landscaper I could recommend. Cap the spring, I said flatly. You want me to cap a natural water source that has been flowing freely for thousands of years. For aesthetics, Sharon confirmed, nodding enthusiastically. And for the good of the community. We all have to make small sacrifices to maintain our property values. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I had chosen to retire early specifically to avoid this kind of stress. Sharon, with all due respect, I am not capping the spring. It is on my property, which predates your HOA, and it is a natural feature. If people do not like seeing water and stones, they probably should not have moved to a town called Ridgemont Springs. Sharon's smile finally cracked. Mr. Quentin, I am trying to be neighborly about this, but the HOA does have certain enforcement mechanisms at our disposal. We can make life quite difficult for residents who refuse to comply with community standards. Is that a threat? I asked, keeping my voice level. It is a reality, Sharon replied. She placed a packet of papers on the stone wall beside the spring. These are the relevant bylaws and aesthetic guidelines. I suggest you review them carefully. We will be discussing your property at our next board meeting on May 15th. I do hope you will see reason by then. She walked back to her Mercedes, her heels crunching on the gravel, and drove away without another word. I picked up the packet she had left behind and flipped through it. The documents were impressively detailed, covering everything from approved paint colors to the maximum height of mailbox posts. Buried in the middle was a section on water features and natural elements, which stated that all visible water features must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee and must conform to the community's aesthetic standards. I called my real estate attorney that same afternoon. Her name was Jennifer Martinez, and she had handled my property closing. Jennifer, I need your opinion on something, I said after explaining the situation. Can they actually force me to cap the spring? Jennifer was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her typing. Let me look at your deed again. Hold on. More typing than a long pause. Okay, so here is the situation. Your property does predate the HOA and you have explicit water rights attached to your deed. Those are really hard to supersede in Colorado. However, the previous owner did sign a voluntary covenant agreement with the HOA back in 2008, probably to smooth over some dispute. That agreement states that while the property maintains its grandfathered status, the owner will make reasonable efforts to maintain aesthetic harmony with the surrounding community. What does reasonable efforts mean? I asked. That is the problem. It is deliberately vague. The HOA could argue that capping the spring is a reasonable effort. You could argue that maintaining a natural water source in its natural state is reasonable. It would probably end up in front of a judge. And how much would that cost me? Jennifer sighed. Honestly, probably $20,000 to $30,000 in legal fees, minimum. Maybe more if they drag it out. HOAs have deep pockets when they want to fight something. I thanked her and hung up, staring out my window at the spring. The afternoon sun was catching the water just right, making it sparkle like diamonds. The idea of covering up something so beautiful for the sake of aesthetic harmony made my stomach turn. Over the next few weeks, I did my research. I pulled up geological surveys of the area, historical documents about the spring, and water rights records going back to the 1800s. What I found was fascinating and deeply concerning. The spring on my property was not just a random water source. It was the primary outlet for a significant limestone aquifer that stretched beneath most of Ridgemont Springs. The natural pressure release from my spring helped maintain the stability and health of the entire aquifer system. The HOA community, I discovered, drew its water from a community well that tapped into that same aquifer. The well had been drilled in 1995 when the development was first built, and according to the permits I dug up from county records, it was already considered marginal at the time. The engineer's report had noted concerns about the aquifer's recharge rate and recommended limiting the number of homes connected to the system. Of course, the developers had ignored that recommendation. Ridgemont Springs had grown from an initial 40 homes to over 90, all drawing from that same well. The only reason it had kept up so far was because my spring was naturally relieving pressure and allowing water to cycle through the system properly. I tried to explain this to Sharon at the HOA board meeting on May 15th. I even brought printed copies of the geological surveys and the original engineer's report. "This is not about geology," Sharon interrupted, barely glancing at my documents. "This is about community standards and property values. Your spring looks like something from a pioneer settlement. It does not fit with the aesthetic we have carefully cultivated here." The other board members nodded in agreement. There was Gerald Thompson, a retired banker who seemed primarily interested in checking his phone. Patricia Hendricks, who owned the local boutique and kept making comments about how the spring probably lowered property values by creating a rustic impression. And finally, Robert Chen, who at least had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable with the whole proceeding. "I am not capping the spring," I repeated for what felt like the 100th time. "And I have explained why doing so would be a terrible idea for everyone involved, including all of you." Sharon's expression hardened. "Then we will be issuing you a formal violation notice. You will have 30 days to comply. If you do not, we will begin assessing daily fines of $250. "This is insane," I said, standing up. "You are willing to risk your community's water supply because you do not like the way natural stones look. We are protecting our property values," Patricia chimed in. "That is what an HOA does." I walked out of that meeting knowing I was in for a fight. The violation notice arrived 3 days later via certified mail, professionally printed on HOA letterhead. It gave me until June 15th to cap the spring and restore the area to a condition approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Failure to comply would result in daily fines, and the HOA reserved the right to enter my property and perform the work themselves, billing me for the cost. I called Jennifer again. "They are serious about this." "They usually are," she said. HOAs can be incredibly petty and they often win through attrition. People just get tired of fighting. "What do you want to do?" "Fight it," I said. "But I need to try something first." I spent the next week putting together a presentation. I created charts showing the aquifer structure, diagrams explaining how the spring maintained pressure balance, and projections of what would happen to the community well if the spring was capped. I even got a letter from my former colleague at the Department of Natural Resources, Dr. Sarah Kim, explaining the hydrological concerns in professional terms. I requested time at the June HOA General Meeting, which Sharon reluctantly granted. On June 3rd, I stood in front of about 40 homeowners in the community center and laid out my case. "I understand that you all value aesthetics," I began. "But what I am trying to explain is that my spring is not just a decorative feature. It is a critical part of the water system that supplies your entire community. If you force me to cap it, you will be disrupting the natural flow that keeps the aquifer healthy. Within a few months, especially during the dry summer season, you are going to see problems with your community well." I showed them the data. explained the science as simply as I could, and even offered to give tours of the spring to anyone interested in understanding the system better. Sharon listened with her arms crossed, her expression growing more annoyed by the minute. When I finished, she stood up and addressed the crowd. What Mr. Quentin fails to understand is that we have professionals who manage our well system. We have been thriving here for years without concerning ourselves with his property. This is simply a delaying tactic to avoid complying with community standards. The question before us is simple. Do we allow one resident to diminish all of our property values with an unsightly feature, or do we maintain the standards that make Ridgemont Springs a desirable place to live? When she put it that way, framed entirely around property values and aesthetics while dismissing the scientific concerns, most of the homeowners sided with her. A few people approached me afterward, including Robert Chen from the board. "I think you might be right about the water," he said quietly. "But Sharon has been president for 6 years, and she has a lot of influence. People trust her judgment. Even when her judgment could leave everyone without water," I asked. Robert shrugged helplessly. "I will keep raising concerns at the board meetings. That is all I can do." The June 15th deadline came and went. I did not cap the spring. On June 16th, the first fine notice arrived, $250, then another the next day, and another the day after that. By the end of June, I had accumulated over $3,000 in fines that the HOA insisted were legally binding. Jennifer filed a motion for an injunction, arguing that the HOA was exceeding its authority and that the fines should be suspended pending a court hearing. The judge agreed to halt the fines temporarily, but scheduled the hearing for August 20th, which felt like a lifetime away. July arrived with the kind of heat that makes Coloradans forget why they love summer. Temperatures pushed into the mid-90s day after day, and the usual afternoon thunderstorms failed to materialize. The spring on my property kept flowing steadily, the water cold and clear, but I noticed the volume starting to decrease slightly. That was normal for summer, but it concerned me given the drought conditions. I kept tabs on the community well through a friend who worked for the county's water resources department. The well was pumping normally, but the water table was starting to drop. Again, not unusual for summer, but the rate of decline was faster than previous years. Then, in mid-July, Sharon escalated things. I came home from a supply run in town to find a construction crew on my property. They had parked their trucks at the end of my driveway and were surveying the spring area with measuring equipment. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, striding toward them. A man in a hard hat turned around, holding a clipboard. "HOA hired us to cap this spring and do the landscaping. We have authorization from Sharon Whitmore. You do not have authorization from me, and this is my property. You are trespassing." The man looked uncomfortable. "Look, buddy, we are just doing the job we were hired for. The HOA said they had the right to do this work." "They lied," I said firmly. "Get off my property right now, or I am calling the sheriff." The crew left, but not before the foreman made a call to Sharon. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. "You are in violation of the HOA covenant," Sharon said without preamble. "We have the right to remedy violations at the owner's expense." "You have the right to do maintenance on common areas," I countered. "Not to come onto private property and destroy a natural water source. What you just did was criminal trespassing, and if you try it again, I will have every single person you send arrested." "We will see what a judge has to say about that," Sharon snapped and hung up. I immediately called Jennifer and reported the incident. She filed an emergency motion, and thankfully, we got in front of a judge within 2 days. The judge was not pleased with the HOA's actions, and issued a temporary restraining order prohibiting them from entering my property or attempting to modify the spring until the main hearing in August. But the damage to my relationship with the community was done. Someone, probably Sharon, spread rumors that I was a difficult, selfish person who cared more about an ugly pile of rocks than being a good neighbor. People I had never met glared at me in the grocery store. Someone left a nasty note on my windshield calling me a blight on the community. Through it all, the summer kept getting hotter and drier. By early August, the mountains that usually stayed green well into autumn were already turning brown. Fire warnings were posted throughout the county. And my spring, while still flowing, had slowed to about 60% of its spring capacity. I drove past the community well house one afternoon and saw several trucks parked outside. Workers were going in and out, looking concerned. I stopped and talked to one of them, a young guy who did not seem to recognize me. "What is going on?" I asked. "Well is not keeping up," he said, shaking his head. "They are going to have to implement water restrictions for the whole HOA. No lawn watering, short showers, the whole deal." I have never seen it this bad. My stomach sank. It was happening exactly as I had predicted, just faster than I had expected. The combination of the drought, the increased demand from 90 homes, and the lack of proper pressure release from my spring was straining the aquifer beyond its capacity. I tried one more time to reach out to Sharon. I called her directly and offered to meet in person. "Sharon, your well is failing. I know you do not want to hear this from me, but you need to bring in a hydrologist before it is too late. The restrictions might not be enough." "Our well is fine," Sharon said coldly. "We are experiencing a drought, just like everyone else in Colorado. It has nothing to do with your spring." "It has everything to do with my spring," I insisted. "The aquifer needs that natural outlet to maintain pressure and flow. By threatening to cap it, by trying to disrupt the system, you have created a crisis." "The only crisis is your refusal to be a team player," Sharon retorted. "We will see you in court next week." She hung up, and I knew I had done everything I could. The court hearing was scheduled for August 20th, and at this point, all I could do was present my evidence and hope the judge understood the science. August 20th arrived with temperatures hitting 98 degrees. The courtroom was mercifully air-conditioned, but you could feel the tension as soon as I walked in. Sharon was there with the entire HOA board and their attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Melissa Bradford who specialized in property law. My attorney, Jennifer, had prepared an extensive case. We had Dr. Sarah Kim on video testimony explaining the aquifer system. We had historical data, geological surveys, and expert opinions from 3 different hydrologists. We had documentation of the declining water table and the stress on the community well. Melissa Bradford, however, focused entirely on the property covenants and HOA regulations. She argued that I had signed those covenants when I purchased the property, that they were legally binding, and that the HOA had both the right and the responsibility to enforce aesthetic standards. "This is not about water," she told the judge. "This is about a homeowner who thinks he is above the rules that everyone else follows. If we allow Mr. Quentin to ignore community standards, what message does that send to every other resident?" The judge, a middle-aged woman named Barbara Fletcher, listened carefully to both sides. She asked pointed questions about the science, the covenants, and the HOA's authority. When she asked about the current water situation in the community, Melissa tried to downplay it. "The community is experiencing drought conditions like the rest of the state, Your Honor. It is being managed appropriately." Judge Fletcher looked skeptical. "But Mr. Quentin and his experts are arguing that capping the spring would worsen that situation." Do you have any expert testimony to refute that? Melissa hesitated. The HOA has consulted with well maintenance professionals who believe the system is sound. Well maintenance professionals are not hydrologists, the judge pointed out. Did the HOA consult with any actual experts in aquifer systems before pursuing this action? The silence that followed answered the question. Judge Fletcher made some notes and then looked up at both parties. I am going to take this under advisement. I will issue a ruling within 2 weeks. In the meantime, the restraining order remains in place. Mr. Quentin, you are not to modify the spring in any way. Miss Whitmore, the HOA is not to enter Mr. Quentin's property or assess any additional fines. Is that clear? We all nodded. As we filed out of the courtroom, I saw Sharon talking urgently with Melissa. Neither of them looked happy. I did not have to wait 2 weeks for vindication, though. The crisis came just 5 days later, on August 25th. I woke up that morning to the sound of my phone ringing insistently. It was Robert Chen from the HOA board. Frederick, we have a serious problem. The community well ran dry overnight, completely dry. 90 families have no running water. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Jesus, have you called emergency services? Sharon is handling it. They are bringing in water trucks, but it is going to take time. Frederick, I think you were right. I think capping your spring or threatening to something disrupted the system. We need help. I got dressed quickly and drove down to the community well house. It was chaos. Dozens of residents were gathered around, some angry, some scared. Children were crying. Water trucks from the county were setting up temporary distribution points. And Sharon was in the middle of it all, trying to maintain control while looking increasingly panicked. When she saw me approaching, her expression hardened. This is not the time, Frederick. Actually, this is exactly the time, I said firmly but not unkindly. You need to bring in a hydrologist right now. Not tomorrow, not next week, right now. And you need to stop fighting me on the spring. The well running dry has nothing to do with your spring, Sharon insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. It has everything to do with it, I said. The aquifer was already stressed. The drought made it worse. And your attempts to cap my spring, the disruption to the natural system, it pushed everything over the edge. A man I recognized from the HOA meeting stepped forward. His name was David Martinez, and he looked furious. Sharon, is this true? Did you know capping his spring could cause problems with our well? He is exaggerating, Sharon said quickly. The drought is the problem. He presented evidence at that meeting in June, David continued. I remember now. He had all those charts and the letter from that water expert. And you dismissed it. Other residents started murmuring, pulling out phones, presumably looking up information or maybe recordings from that meeting. The mood was shifting and Sharon could feel it. We followed proper procedures, she said defensively. The board voted. The board voted without consulting any actual experts, Robert Chen said, stepping up beside me. I tried to raise concerns, but I was outvoted. Frederick warned us this could happen, and we did not listen. The crowd's anger was now turning toward Sharon and the board. People were shouting questions, demanding answers, asking why they had not been told about the potential risks. It was getting ugly. Everyone, please, I said loudly, holding up my hands. This is not about blame right now, it is about fixing the problem. Sharon, I am serious. You need an emergency hydrologist out here today. I can give you Dr. Kim's number. She consults on situations like this. Sharon looked at me for a long moment, her carefully constructed authority crumbling around her. Finally, she nodded stiffly. Fine, give me the number. I texted her Dr. Kim's contact information. Then I addressed the crowd. In the meantime, my spring is still flowing. It is not enough for 90 households, but it can supplement the water trucks. Anyone who needs drinking water, you can come to my property with clean containers. I will help however I can." The relief on people's faces was immediate. Over the next several hours, I had a steady stream of neighbors coming to fill jugs, bottles, and containers from my spring. I showed them the testing reports proving the water was safe. I helped families with small children first, then elderly residents, then everyone else. Dr. Kim arrived that evening along with a team from the State Water Resources Department. She spent hours surveying the area, testing the well, and examining my spring. When she finally came to talk to me, she looked grave. "You were right about everything," she said. "The aquifer was already marginal, and the drought stressed it further. But the real problem is that the community well is pulling water faster than the aquifer can naturally recharge. Your spring was acting as a critical pressure release and circulation point. When the HOA started threatening to cap it, even just surveying and preparing for the work, they disrupted the natural flow patterns. Combined with everything else, it was enough to tip the system into failure." "Can it be fixed?" I asked. "Maybe," Sarah said. "They need to drill a new well in a different location, tapping into a different part of the aquifer, and they absolutely cannot cap your spring. In fact, they might need to consider enhancing the spring's flow, creating additional outlet points to help the aquifer recover." She delivered this same report to Sharon and the HOA board in an emergency meeting that night. I was invited to attend, along with most of the community residents who wanted answers. Sarah did not pull any punches. "The situation here is critical. You have 90 homes drawing from an aquifer that was never designed to support that kind of demand. The drought has exacerbated the problem, but the fundamental issue is overuse and poor planning from the beginning. Mr. Quentin's spring has been helping to maintain system stability, and any attempt to cap or modify it would be catastrophic. How long until we have running water again?" Someone called out from the crowd. "That depends on several factors," Sarah replied. "Short term, you will need to rely on water trucks and conservation measures. Medium term, I recommend drilling a new well at a location I have identified about half a mile east of here. That should provide adequate supply if you also implement strict usage guidelines. Long term, this community needs to consider connecting to the municipal water system or significantly reducing water demand." The cost estimates she provided were staggering. Drilling a new well would cost between $100,000 and $150,000. Connecting to the municipal system would be over $1 million. And all of this while the community was already paying for emergency water delivery. Sharon looked like she might be sick. "We do not have that kind of money in reserves," she admitted quietly. "Then you will need to do a special assessment on all the homeowners," Sarah said bluntly. "This is not optional. You need water." The meeting devolved into chaos after that. People were angry, scared, and looking for someone to blame. Most of that blame landed squarely on Sharon and the board for ignoring my warnings and prioritizing aesthetics over basic infrastructure needs. I slipped out quietly and went home, exhausted. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Hearing this, I think the judge will rule in your favor. Call me tomorrow." She was right. Judge Fletcher's ruling came down on September 2nd, just over a week after the well went dry. The decision was thorough and decisive. She found that the HOA had exceeded its authority in attempting to force me to cap the spring, that the aesthetic covenant did not supersede my water rights, and that the HOA had failed to exercise due diligence in understanding the consequences of their demands. More significantly, she ordered the HOA to cease all enforcement actions against me, dismissed all fines that had been assessed, and required the HOA to pay my legal fees, which had climbed to nearly $22,000. She also included a strongly worded section about the responsibility of HOA boards to consult with appropriate experts before making decisions that could impact critical infrastructure. The ruling made local news. HOA ignored water expert, caused community crisis, read the headline in the Ridgemont Springs Gazette. The story spread to regional outlets, and soon my phone was ringing with reporters wanting interviews. I kept my comments measured. I tried to warn them about the risks. I wish they had listened. Now the focus needs to be on getting the community back on track with a sustainable water supply. But the damage to Sharon's reputation and the HOA board was severe. Within 2 weeks, a petition started circulating calling for a special election to recall the entire board. The petition needed signatures from 40% of homeowners, and it reached that threshold in just 5 days. Sharon tried to fight it at first, arguing that the recall was unjustified and that the drought was the real culprit, not her decisions. But the evidence was overwhelming. At a packed community meeting on September 23rd, resident after resident stood up to speak about how they had been ignored, how concerns had been dismissed, and how the board had prioritized aesthetics over basic safety and infrastructure. David Martinez, who had confronted Sharon at the well house, gave a particularly pointed speech. "My family was without water for 2 weeks. My daughter, who is 5 years old, asked me why we could not take a bath. And the reason, the real reason, is that our HOA president was more concerned about how a natural spring looked than about whether we would have water to drink. That is not leadership. That is vanity." The recall vote took place on October 8th. Sharon, Patricia, and Gerald were all voted out by margins of over 70%. Robert Chen, who had tried to raise concerns, was allowed to stay, and he was joined by 3 new board members, including David Martinez. The new board's first action was to formally apologize to me and to thank me for providing emergency water access during the crisis. Their second action was to approve the drilling of a new community well at the location Dr. Kim had recommended, funded by a special assessment of $1,200 per household. Sharon did not go quietly. She sent a mass email to all residents claiming she was being made a scapegoat, that the drought was an act of God, and that she had done her best under difficult circumstances. But very few people were listening anymore. When you have to truck in drinking water for your children because your HOA president refused to listen to a hydrologist, apologies and excuses ring pretty hollow. I thought that would be the end of it, but there was one more twist. In late October, I received a call from the Colorado Attorney General's office. An investigator named Thomas Reeves wanted to talk to me about the HOA's actions. "Mr. Quentin, we have been reviewing the situation in Ridgemont Springs," he said when we met at a coffee shop in town. "Based on what we have found, there are potential criminal implications to what occurred." I set down my coffee cup. "Criminal implications," Thomas nodded. "The HOA board, specifically Miss Whitmore, was warned repeatedly by you and by other residents that capping the spring could endanger the community's water supply. She proceeded anyway, even to the point of sending contractors onto your property without authorization. When the well failed, 90 families were left without water. In Colorado, recklessly endangering public health and safety, particularly water resources, can be prosecuted as a criminal offense." "You are talking about charging Sharon with a crime?" I asked, surprised. "Potentially," Thomas said. "We are also looking at whether she violated state water laws." Colorado takes water rights very seriously, and interfering with a natural water source that serves a critical hydrological function could constitute a violation. I need your full cooperation with our investigation." I provided Thomas with everything I had: my documentation, the expert reports, recordings from HOA meetings, correspondence with Sharon, the court documents, all of it. The investigation took 3 months, but on January 14th of the following year, the Attorney General's office announced that Sharon Whitmore was being charged with reckless endangerment and unlawful interference with water resources. The news hit the community like a bombshell. Whatever sympathy Sharon had left evaporated when people realized she might actually go to jail for what she had done. The trial was scheduled for March. I was called to testify. Walking into that courtroom and seeing Sharon at the defendant's table was surreal. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had been acting in good faith based on the information available to her, that the drought was an unforeseeable natural disaster, and that criminal charges were excessive. But the prosecution, led by a sharp young attorney named Rachel Torres, methodically laid out the evidence. She showed that I had warned Sharon multiple times, in writing and in person. She presented Dr. Kim's testimony about the hydrological risks. She showed the HOA meeting minutes where Robert Chen had raised concerns that were dismissed. She demonstrated that Sharon had been more concerned with property values than public safety. The most damning evidence was an email Sharon had sent to Patricia Hendricks in July, about a month before the well failed. In it, Sharon wrote, "Frederick's fear-mongering about the aquifer is just a tactic to avoid compliance. Even if there is some minor impact on water levels, it will be worth it to finally get rid of that eyesore and bring his property up to community standards." Rachel Torres read that email aloud in court, and you could feel the room turn cold. Sharon had acknowledged the possibility of water impacts and decided that aesthetics were more important. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Sharon guilty on both counts. At her sentencing hearing in April, the judge sentenced her to 18 months in prison, suspended to 6 months with probation, plus a fine of $50,000 and 200 hours of community service related to water conservation education. Standing outside the courthouse after sentencing, I was approached by a reporter from Denver's Channel 7. "Mr. Quentin, how do you feel about the outcome?" she asked, holding up a microphone. I thought carefully about my answer. "I feel sad that it came to this. I never wanted Sharon Whitmore to go to jail. I just wanted her to listen, to take the science seriously, to prioritize people's basic needs over aesthetics. I hope this case sends a message to HOA boards everywhere that they have real responsibilities, and that ignoring expert advice about critical infrastructure can have serious consequences." The reporter nodded. "What about your spring? Is it still flowing?" I smiled. "It is. The new community well has been online for 2 months now, and it is working great. The aquifer is recovering. And my spring is still there, still natural, still beautiful. It is doing what it has been doing for thousands of years, helping to maintain the balance of the water system beneath our feet." The community, under its new board leadership, had actually embraced the spring. They installed a small historical marker near the edge of my property, with my permission, explaining the geological significance of the natural spring and its role in the local aquifer system. School groups came to visit as part of environmental education programs. What Sharon had seen as an eyesore became a point of pride for Ridgemont Springs. The legal battle and its aftermath had taken over a year of my life, cost me sleep and stress and peace of mind. But standing by my spring on a cool morning in May, watching the water flow clear and cold over the ancient stones, I felt like it had been worth it. Some things are more important than property values and aesthetic guidelines. Water, life, truth, those are worth fighting for. Robert Chen stopped by one afternoon that May with a bottle of wine and an apology. "I should have fought harder," he said. "I knew you were right, but I did not want to rock the boat." "You are fighting now," I said, accepting the wine. "That is what matters." We sat by the spring and talked about the future. The HOA was considering new bylaws that would require expert consultation before any major infrastructure decisions. They were implementing water conservation measures and native landscaping to reduce demand on the aquifer. They were even talking about protecting natural features within the community rather than trying to eliminate them. "Sharon saw this place as something to control and perfect," Robert said, watching the water flow. "But that was never realistic. We live in a high desert. Water is precious here, and we need to respect the natural systems that provide it." I raised my glass. "I will drink to that." The summer came again, hot and dry like the year before. But this time, Ridgemont Springs was prepared. The new well pumped steadily. Residents followed conservation guidelines. My spring continued to do its job, maintaining pressure and circulation in the aquifer below. And on those quiet evenings when I sat by the water, listening to its eternal song, I thought about how close we had come to disaster. How easily it could have been prevented if one person had been willing to listen, to learn, to put science and safety ahead of vanity. I also thought about all the other communities out there, governed by HOA boards who might be making similar mistakes. People who meant well, perhaps, but who lacked the expertise or the humility to recognize when they were wrong. The story of Ridgemont Springs had been covered widely enough that maybe, just maybe, some of those boards would think twice before prioritizing aesthetics over infrastructure, before dismissing expert warnings, before assuming they knew better than the scientists and hydrologists and engineers who actually understood these complex systems. My retirement had turned out to be far more eventful than I had planned. I had expected to spend my days hiking, reading, and enjoying the peace of my little property with its historic house and natural spring. Instead, I had spent a year fighting an HOA, testifying in court, and becoming an unwitting spokesman for sensible water management. But as I sat there that summer evening, watching the sun set over the Colorado mountains, seeing the light dance on the flowing water of my spring, I realized I would not change any of it. Sometimes the right fight finds you, even when you are not looking for it. And sometimes standing your ground, speaking the truth, and refusing to back down matters more than peace and quiet. The spring had been flowing for thousands of years before I bought the property. If I had done my job right, if I had protected it from short-sighted demands and bureaucratic overreach, it would flow for thousands of years more. That felt like a legacy worth having. In June, I got a letter from a homeowner in a development outside Boulder. They were facing a similar situation with their HOA trying to remove a natural wetland for aesthetic reasons, and they wanted advice on how to fight back. I wrote them a detailed response, shared my documentation and legal strategies, and connected them with Jennifer and Dr. Kim. Then another letter came, from Arizona this time. Then another from New Mexico. Apparently, the story of Ridgemont Springs had resonated with people across the western United States, where water is always precious and often contested. I found myself becoming an informal consultant for homeowners fighting their HOAs over natural features and water resources. I did not charge for my time. How could I? I knew exactly what they were going through, the frustration of not being heard, the fear that bureaucracy would triumph over common sense. By autumn, I had helped a dozen different homeowners in 8 different states. Some won their fights. A couple lost. but all of them appreciated having someone who understood both the science and the legal complexities, someone who had been through the battle and come out the other side. The new year arrived, bringing with it a fresh perspective on everything that had happened. Ridgemont Springs was thriving under its new leadership. The water system was stable. Property values, ironically, had actually increased because people wanted to live in a community that had learned from its mistakes and prioritized sustainability. Sharon served her 6 months and was released in October. I saw her once from a distance at the grocery store. She did not approach me, and I did not approach her. Some wounds take a long time to heal if they heal at all. But the spring kept flowing, indifferent to human drama and legal battles and community politics. It flowed in winter when ice formed at its edges. It flowed in spring when the snowmelt made it run full and strong. It flowed in summer when the heat made every drop precious. And it flowed in autumn when the aspen trees turned gold and dropped their leaves into its clear pools. I am 51 now, truly retired, though not in the way I had originally imagined. My days are still peaceful, but they are punctuated by emails from homeowners fighting their HOAs, by consultations with hydrologists and environmental lawyers, by occasional speaking engagements at community meetings where people want to hear about what happened in Ridgemont Springs. I have become, in my own small way, a voice for the idea that natural systems matter more than aesthetic conformity, that expert advice should be heeded, and that HOA boards have a responsibility to make informed, thoughtful decisions rather than knee-jerk reactions based on personal preferences. And through it all, my spring flows on, a testament to the power of standing firm, speaking truth, and refusing to let bureaucracy triumph over common sense. It is not just water flowing over ancient stones. It is a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, that expertise matters, that nature does not bend to human vanity, and that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. When I look back on that day in April when Sharon first approached me about capping the spring, I am struck by how different things could have been. If I had given in, tried to keep the peace, avoided conflict, 90 families would have lost their water supply even sooner. The aquifer might have been damaged beyond repair, and Sharon would never have faced consequences for prioritizing aesthetics over public safety. Instead, I stood my ground. I fought back with science and facts and determination. I weathered the fines and the legal bills and the community hostility. And in the end, truth won out. Not easily, not cheaply, but decisively. That is what I want people to remember about the Ridgemont Springs water crisis. Not that an HOA president went to jail, though that is part of the story. Not that I won a legal battle, though that mattered too. But that when experts warn you about consequences, when science tells you something matters more than appearances, when the choice is between vanity and safety, you need to choose wisely, because water does not care about aesthetic guidelines. Aquifers do not respond to HOA bylaws. Natural systems follow natural laws, and ignoring those laws has natural consequences. My spring taught me that lesson long before Sharon arrived with her aesthetic demands, and her certainty that appearances mattered more than reality. The spring had been there for millennia, shaped by geology and hydrology and the patient work of water on stone. It would be there for millennia more, long after HOAs and property values and human concerns had faded into history. All I did was protect it long enough for everyone else to understand what I had known from the beginning, that some things are more important than fitting in, more valuable than conformity, more essential than the approval of neighbors who cannot see past the surface to the depths beneath. The spring flows, the community thrives, And I rest easy knowing that when it mattered most, when the choice was between comfort and conviction, I chose conviction. That is enough for me. That is everything, really.